All right, we got a lot to get into today. Even though this is considered kind of an empty spot on the sports calendar, there's a lot going on. I think right off the top, let's talk about the Red Sox because they had they could have nice things for maybe 48 hours. Had the news come in that they had signed Alex Bregman to fill out their infield, fill out their lineup, and then just like that, Rafael Devers had to go and poop all over it, saying that he does not want to move off of third base. When asked if he would rule out a trade, he would not say he would rule out a trade. On top of that, I've been digging into a lot of the numbers as it goes to Rafael Devers, and we've always known that he's a terrible third baseman. I have always thought he's a bad third baseman, but with the little kind of research I've been doing the last couple of days, he's jaw-droppingly bad. Which okay, we got some disagreement here. All right, let's get into it.
I also kind of disagree with that characterization.
Okay. How what is your overall take on the Rafael Devers situation before we get into his defensive inability?
Yeah, I would just say I think there are a lot of nuances in this thing, and I would say I have a different view of how Rafael Devers is handling it than I do how Tristan Cassis is handling it. I think those are two different things. With Devers, it's tough, right? I think, and I might be giving him too much credit here, but I do think sometimes with players like him, some of this stuff gets a little lost in translation. Like when you're dealing with a guy who English isn't his first language and it's going through a translator, I think things like the nope, no, it can come off more blunt than it was intended. I'm not saying that's what happened. I just always sort of leave open the possibility for that's what's happening, where it just sounds worse to our English speaking selves than it does to someone who's going through a translator. That maybe he really wasn't that dismissive and blunt, in his mind. What you have an objection?
I'll give you that. However, I perceive it the other way because translators are usually, I think actually always, team employees. So whenever I do hear a quote that comes through a translator, I assume that there is a little bit of whitewashing that's going on with what they're saying. So in my mind, when I heard the translator say what they said, I honestly thought, wow, if the translated version is this kind of plain, I can only imagine what the actual thing that was said was. Sorry, go ahead, Logan.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I agree with Ben in terms of like where the translation probably played. Like, if anything, that watered it down. I'll say, like, is it the worst thing that he thinks he's a third baseman? Like, you paid the guy a massive deal that is commensurate with what a premier third baseman would get. So I'd be more concerned if he was like, yeah, I'll go to first, like, very willingly. And he's also like, his development at third base has been a very big thing over the last few years, especially like earlier on in his career, but to this day. And I do get the sense that it's something that he's taken a lot of pride in. It's gotten considerably better than it was when he broke into the big leagues. But it's like, I don't know. Bregman still might be a better fit at third base, and that doesn't mean that Devers is wrong for saying I'm a third baseman. Like, I'm more interested to see what the fallout is if they actually pull the trigger on moving Bregman to third. Like, that's when Devers' response actually matters.
Yeah, and I think part of it is he was in a lose-lose situation with that line of questioning, which is kind of what you alluded to. Like, if he says that he's willing to go to DH at first, people would call him lazy, and if he did what he ultimately did, which is saying no, I'm not moving off third, he's a jerk. And so, not to mention, I don't know who the reporter was, but somebody asked him about his weight, which was a little wild. But it seems like
that's pertinent to the conversation, though, isn't it?
It is. I don't know.
That has been part of it.
Yeah, to Logan's point about all the work he's done. I think that there would be my opinion on his positional situation would be far different if he came into camp in the best shape of his life, saying, listen, this is the second year of me supposedly being the leader of this ball club, and I am going to commit myself to my health and which impacts my play on the field. And
yeah, but I don't know how often he's come. I think there was that one
he
season
never
a couple
comes
years
in
ago.
shape. Never.
I ultimately just think that sometimes what happens in Boston, and it's especially happened a lot since Belichick left, is like I think the media is trying to hold a lot of players and coaches to this potentially like unrealistic middle ground standard where you don't want Belichick, who was insane, who was closed off and disingenuous to an extreme, and you don't want total transparency because it's viewed as, not good for the team. And creating media firestorm. So you ultimately want everyone to find some sort of middle ground. And yeah, like in my head, I think that's probably not that hard to find. It's just some version of like, hey, I view myself as a third baseman. I've always played it. I pride myself in getting better, but I'll do what the team wants me to do. That's probably all you have to say. But like some guys just maybe aren't as good at finding that middle ground. Maybe the media coaching with the Red Sox isn't great. I think it very clearly isn't great if we're being honest. So I don't know. Maybe I'm giving the guys too much credit, but I try and give them some slack because I just think we pick them apart to such a degree, and we expect them to reach this ideal middle ground that I'm just not sure is realistic for most players.
Yeah, I mean, no answer is going to be completely satisfactory for everyone, but like, I don't know. I almost feel like a hardo because I've got very few issues with what he's said so far. Like, he should believe he's a third baseman. He was signed to be a third baseman. The one, uh, I guess, like caveat I will allow is the notion that, well, he got paid already, so he should be more willing to do what's best for the team. And I would be curious, maybe he did get asked this, and I probably should have dug in on it more, but I wonder if anyone asked Casas how he would feel about being a DH. Because he got the line of questioning about like, what do you think about being, the Devers third baseman thing or whatever. And it sounded like he was being kind of like smug or sly or something like that. But my follow-up question would have been, what if they ask you to be the DH? Because you want to talk about defensive liabilities. Like, it's not like Casas is like any huge asset over at first base. So if playing the field is so important for Devers, and I can sooner see a world where Tristan Casas becomes like the JD Martinez type, where he just wants to fixate on hitting. And then you move Devers to first and you go from there, and maybe that kind of smooths everything over. I would be curious about that, but that's the one thing I'll allow for is that Devers theoretically could be at a position in his career where he should just care about winning. Like, no matter what, he's getting paid. So I do understand the frustration from some fans that are like, just do what's best for the team. But from a pure competitiveness standpoint, it makes plenty of sense to me that he's like, I was brought up as a third baseman. I've been the third baseman here for what, 7 years, 8 years now. Like, that it should be his job to lose, and he should feel that way.
I also think what we don't know too is, and I wish this would have been asked too, is what were the conversations like when you did your negotiations with the Red Sox before your contract? I'm sure this came up, and was it like they said you're our third baseman, like permanently for as long as you want to be? Is it, hey, are you open to changing positions after a few years or somewhere down the road? Like what?
Cora already threw cold water on that.
Yeah.
Cora says like the people who signed him were the last front office.
Right.
He said Himes in St. Louis. So like, I think they know that that's totally out the window. Any assurances he was given, except for maybe from John Henry, but I don't think John Henry would be saying you're going to be the third baseman forever. That doesn't seem like his deal.
So then it becomes like, so how does that? If you're Devers, if you signed a huge contract, and it's easy for us to be like, dude, you're making 300 something million, just let it go. But if he signed the contract partly with the understanding like, hey, you guys are going to give me run to play third base, I can understand the frustration. It doesn't mean you should draw a line and be like, I'm not moving, but I get the frustration. I also think, it's easy for people to point toward, Bregman's comments, team first comments, or someone like Altuve willingly moving to the outfield. But those guys are very different stages of their career. They're in their 30s. Like, I just don't, those are apples to oranges to me. So I don't know.
Yeah, for me, it's not. My thing about the infield alignment is much less so March 30th, 2025, or whatever day the season begins, because I actually think that it's better to be stronger up the middle, at second base and shortstop with Story and Bregman, and to be serviceable at first base than it is to have a sterling defensive third baseman right now. The reason that I think that this is a bad stance for Devers to be starting with is in 2026 there's a possibility that your best infield is Bregman at third, Story at short, or maybe even Mayer at short towards the end of the year, Campbell at second, or Mayer at second, and somebody else at first base. So, and then Devers obviously at DH. So that to me is the kind of the issue, is that it's looking forward to hopefully when they're going to actually be good and those runs that he gives up really matter. I'm with you. Like I watch almost every Red Sox game, and I was with you, I should say, about a week ago, where I was like, yeah, I mean, he's bad, but he's not historically bad. And then I started looking at it and I was like, oh my God, he is historically bad. He's been the worst third baseman, not only over the stretch of his last, I think, like 6 years defensively, but like each of those 6 years, he's also almost perennially led the league in, or led the league? No, not like, but been last in the league in runs saved at third base. And then beyond that, you just have just the embarrassing plays that he has had. Like, he hasn't just had like, these are some tough plays. Like, he's had like routine ground ball. He fields it. He fires it into the stands. I mean, I'll never forget, I think it was 2021, routine ground ball to third. He goes, he boots it. Well, he's trying to go get the ball he booted. He runs into the runner going second to third base, so he interferes with them, and then he doesn't get to the booted ball in time to stop that runner from scoring. And I was like, holy macaroni. Like,
yeah, I see. So
the floor is low. The floor is really low with him.
Yeah, for me, it's tough because I think there are a few things here. Number one, I think it's undeniable. I don't know, maybe not necessarily in the stats, but eye test alone, he's definitely gotten better on defense since he came into the league. Like, I think,
he can make some incredible plays for an objectively bad defensive player. He makes fantastic plays.
Well,
sometimes.
but there's like a Pablo Sandoval element there, where like even where they look spectacular, because he's like flailing to his right and then coming up and making amazing, and you're like, well, wait a second, like, if that was Alex Bregman, he would have just taken 2 steps to his right and picked it up and thrown it to first base.
Yeah, but so I think his numbers are definitely skewed. Like, he makes a lot of great plays and high-end plays throughout the season, and then he botches these routine plays that skew the numbers. And I also think a big element of this is he hasn't had any consistency at shortstop. So, I mean, I think Devers' biggest issue, and the majority of his errors and his problems are ranged to his left. And I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but someone did share them with me recently, where his numbers with Story at short versus his numbers without Story at short are stark. There's a massive difference. So I just think I'm allowing for the possibility that with a full season of Trevor Story, obviously not a guarantee, that we'll get a much more consistent and reliable Rafael Devers. And the final variable, I think, these guys aren't robots. And some guys don't handle full-time DHing well. I mean, Yoshida's numbers on offense when he starts as a DH versus when he plays in the outfield are also stark. And some guys just need to play defense to get into the flow of it. So you just kind of get into weighing the pros and cons. Like, do we tell him to pound sand and deal with it? What does that do to his offensive numbers? So I don't think it's as black and white as, shut up and go DH. So that's why I'm just like, I want to see it for a little while. If by the middle of the season, it's like, no, our best team is you rotating DH first with Cassis and Bregman at third and Campbell at second, then you got to tell him, like, tough. But in the meantime, I'm willing to see how it looks.
They should be able to play Bregman at second and third. Like, I know you probably shouldn't be paying a utility guy $40 million a year, but like, because they do have Yoshida Casas, and Devers who could all DH, and that's assuming Yoshida doesn't get traded. But it's like you should be able to cycle Devers through as a DH every now and again and put Bregman at third. Because assuming one of Romy Gonzalez or David Hamilton makes the roster as a spare infielder, like there's your backup second baseman.
Rafaela too.
And Rafaela too can obviously play there, right?
There's also
I have
DH
a
opportunities for Bregman since he's right-handed.
right. So one just random hypothetical that I just thought of, but say the Red Sox either don't have Devers or Devers was more amenable to moving positions. Do you think Bregman's here on a long-term deal? Like, I wonder if the year-by-year thing is because of the uncertainty about where to put him. Like, for this year, you can figure it out. Maybe he opts out, something like that. Like, you can tolerate this for a couple years, but I just had the thought, like, they've known for a while that this was going to be Devers' response. So I wonder if they knew that that was their only path, and that kind of prevented them from doing something longer term with them.
I think it's more about the proximity of Meyer and Campbell, where like there's a non-zero chance that as soon as by the end of the season, both of those guys are, at least from an offensive standpoint, more impactful than Alex Bregman. Then you don't want to hitch your wagons to a guy for 5 more years. Maybe a little bit of both. I also think it's interesting that like the three players sort of caught in the middle of all of this are Casas, Devers, and Vladdy Jr. to a degree, and all three of those guys are like they came up playing third. They probably can play first. They're probably DHs. It's like, well, in the like if the Red Sox go sign Vladdy Jr. next year and somehow don't trade Tristan Casas, are we going to have like some rotation with the three of them playing first and DH? Maybe someone going to third in a pinch. It just doesn't seem sustainable. Like something's got to give there. It's probably Casas, but.
No, I like.
So
the
what would
Casas
be your
DH idea? That has not been floated a lot, but yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Logan.
Well, I was gonna say, so I'm curious, everyone, who would be your ideal trade candidate between Devers, Casas, and Yoshida in terms of people who would reasonably get moved, like balancing the return you would get versus the immediate drop off to this year's team?
I mean, I wouldn't include Yoshida in that. I think they would like to attach Yoshida into any deal involving those guys, but I think after what happened with David Price and Mookie Betts, they should think long and hard about doing that again and willingly lessening the return, which is what happened with the Mookie Betts deal. Like, you don't want to attach Yoshida to Devers and then have to accept a trio of like, prospects that rank between like 8 and 10 in someone else's organization. Like, you need to get an absolute stud. So, but that's tough. I think, ask me in a year, because, there's a non-zero chance that Casas has the season that I think a lot of people believe he's capable of, which is like 275, 35 homers. And if that happens, then you could certainly get a lot for him, maybe even more than Devers, depending on if there's another season of Devers getting banged up, playing bad defense at third. Because at that point, they're both first basemen. And I think so I don't know. It's a good one. I would probably.
That's a thinker, isn't it?
A lot of this is colored by the fact that, according to some reports, they tried to trade Casas with Yoshida attached, and they couldn't do it. So if that is to be believed, then that kind of makes this an academic argument.
Personally, those are also two depressed assets.
Yeah. So personally, I mean, I've said it before. I love Casas's ceiling. I just don't know that he's ever going to be able to stay healthy. And I do think that there's a possibility that you could trade him as a younger asset for something more. That being said, supposedly there was a deal that had him for Luis Castillo in some way, shape, or form that didn't happen. So if that didn't happen, maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe he's not an asset that you can trade to get a top flight talent in return.
I think it's
I don't know if he is right now.
Yeah, I think with the Red Sox, like, give it a year with Casas, maybe to the deadline. Then everyone has a better idea of what his value is, and you can do a trade that makes more sense. And just the more I've thought about it, I think it's inevitable that he gets moved, just because they want to sign Campbell and Anthony especially to these extensions to buy out their arbitration years like they did with Rafael and Bayo. Maybe Meyer is ultimately trade bait, but they want to sign those guys. They might have to sign Duran. They want to sign Vladdy. Someone, same math they ran into back in the late 2010s when you're like, there's not room for Bogarts, Betts, and Chris Sale in all of this. And ultimately, they chose Chris Sale, right? And so they're gonna have to make one of those calls again. And it feels to me like Cassis would be the one squeezed out, both in terms of the other options you have, the headache, and the return you can get for him.
Well, I've said repeatedly that first basemen are a dime a dozen, and I think that's why power hitting first baseman that is, and that's why I think it was tough to move Costas this offseason, is because you haven't really seen the next generation Freddie Freeman we were told he was going to be, and so why would you trade a very
It's like the Garrett
using
Crochet of first baseman?
Right, it's like why
you're
would
paying for what you're pretty sure he's going to be, but you don't really have much evidence to support it outside of short bursts.
Exactly. So it's like he probably needs more than a month-long period of being red hot. And if I'm the Mariners, for example, I'm not trading Luis Castillo when there is a distinct possibility this guy becomes Ty France, who they just DFA'd after signing to a longer-term deal, I think. So, there's a lot of room for things to go wrong, or for him to just be like a mid-tier, Garrett Cooper type. So, I do think that that's probably why he was borderline untradeable this offseason, is it's like there's a lot of room for things to go wrong with him where I wouldn't give a massive haul for him yet.